It is a beautiful day. I am grateful to be alive and share this day with you. Today, we're going to talk about the second episode in the series Help Your Body Heal. This episode is about salt. It is called Salt, Sweat, and Inflammation, or Biological Programming for a Niche We No Longer Live in. The goal of this talk is to talk about why salt is important for our body, what it does for us, and how our body uses it. The overview of this talk is, first we'll talk about salt, particularly sodium, but also potassium. And then we'll talk about how the body uses it, how it stores it. We'll talk about where salt is found in nature and the niche that humans had lived in for the bulk of our existence. So we've been around for about 300,000 years. And it's just in the last 10,000 years that we've settled down into this type of agriculture living, where we're pretty sedentary. But for the majority of our existence, 290,000 years, we were living as hunter-gatherers that were moving around a lot. So I will talk about that niche that we lived in. A niche is a word that describes an area of the universe that is particularly suited to an animal. So all animals, they have different attributes, skills, adaptations, and animals end up finding a particular way of life that other animals are not that good at living like that, but that one animal is, and that is their niche. And I'll talk about the niche that humans have lived in for the bulk of our existence, and what does salt have to do with that, and what does that have to do with us living now in our modern age. Once we talk about that, we'll get a better idea about how much salt is good for the body. And it's really a balance of salt intake by our diet and salt excretion. That's through sweat and urine. In that balance is really how much salt you're eating and excreting. So we'll talk about both of those things. What are the common foods that we eat these days? How much salt is in them? Also, what are ways that we can improve the balance by excreting more salt through exercise and sweating, warm weather, saunas, things like that. Also importantly, salt is necessary for life. So if you don't get enough, you get a condition called hyponatremia. That just means that you don't have enough sodium, and that could be fatal. So I'll talk about what you might feel if you're not getting enough sodium. Putting all that together, we'll talk about how to help your body heal now that we live in a modern agricultural society where we don't have to move around very much, and we live in climate-controlled rooms with, well, a lot of us do, with air conditioning. Or you might live in a cold climate where you don't need to sweat very much. So that is the overview of what we'll talk about today. So to get started, we'll talk about what is sodium. So sodium is a metal ion. It is it's found in rocks, which it's not that common in the mountains, but occasionally you'll see like goats or deer find some rocks that have salt in it, and they will lick that. It's much easier, sodium is much easier to find near water. So like dried up or lake beds that are evaporating, you can find salt there. And then of course the ocean. The ocean has tons of salt. Humans have been farming salt or harvesting salt from dried up seawater for a very, very, very long time. But if you're not by the ocean or if you're not by the lake, salt is actually very hard to come by. When I was hiking, or multiple times when I've been hiking or backpacking, I'll run into animals in the mountains, such as mountain goats or deer, or, well, those are the two that I'm thinking about in particular. And sometimes they will follow me. I remember one deer followed me for, I think, like 2 or 3 miles. It might have been more. That deer followed me and my friend and followed us to our campsite until we peed. And then when we peed on the dirt, once we walked away, the deer went to where we peed and started chomping on the dirt to get the salt. So if you imagine if we were the deer, that salt is so valuable that you'd be willing to eat the dirt that someone else peed on. Now, I find that very hard to imagine that I would be in a state where I would see someone else pee and then I would go eat the dirt that they peed on. But the animals, they want the salt so bad that they're willing to do that. So that shows that there's something very valuable about it. So what's so valuable about sodium, salt, for our body? Well, our body is mostly made up of water. So me here, I forget the number. I think we're like 2/3 water. But that water is not pure water. Pure water has like nothing except for H2O in it. But that's not how the water is in our bodies. In our bodies, the water is a salt solution. So wherever the sodium is, there's usually water. I'll go into that in more detail because it's a little bit more complicated than that. But wherever the water is, there's going to be sodium on the outside of our cells. So our whole body is made up of little tiny cells. There's a lot of them. On the outside of the cell is salt water, sodium water. Inside the cell, so here's a cell. There's water and sodium on the outside. That's where like blood vessels are. That's where like in between the cells there's like cartilage, collagen, those kinds of things, just kind of to hold the cells to each other. But inside the cells, there's actually not much sodium. It's potassium, so that's a different type of salt. So it's a balance of sodium and potassium. So potassium's inside, sodium's outside. If we don't have enough sodium on the outside, then we get dehydrated. There's not enough water flowing through our blood vessels to keep those cells alive. So you need blood flowing by with water and nutrients like glucose, which is sugar. You need oxygen and glucose, so oxygen and sugar, flowing by to keep these cells alive. And in order to do that, you need sodium to have the water. So if you don't get enough sodium, you can't keep your body alive. So that's how valuable sodium is. Now potassium, you also need potassium because you need potassium to fill up the water inside the cell. So the cell's like a sack. There's all kinds of different shapes of cells. But if you can just imagine like a sphere or a block cell, it's filled with potassium. You need potassium to fill that up. And in fact, nerve cells, so I used to be a neurosurgeon, so I used to work on nerves. And nerves communicate by exchanging sodium and potassium and other ions across the surface of the cell, and it sends an electrical signal down this cable called an axon. And that's how nerves talk to each other. That's how your brain works. That's how your brain senses everything else in your body, is through the movement of sodium ions, or salt, from inside to outside the cell and then back to the outside. So sodium is necessary for us to deliver oxygen and sugar to the cells to keep them alive. It's also necessary for our brain and our nerves to communicate with each other. So that's just two functions that salt does. A third function is it's in our sweat. Now that's very important. And this brings us to the second part of the talk, which is what is the niche that humans have lived in for the bulk of our existence, majority of our existence. So it's thought that we've been around for around 300,000 years. So that's a really long time. But the way we live now has been around since 10,000 years. So, and the way we live now is, we have very intensive farming. We're growing foods on large parts of land, and we have a lot of food. And because we have a lot of food, we have a lot of people. But not everyone is farming. Actually, only a small fraction of us are farming. The rest of us are doing other things. So the majority of us don't have to move around very much anymore. But this is not how humans have lived for the majority of our existence. So of the 300,000 years that's thought that we've been around, 290,000 of those years we were hunter-gatherers. So living in small tribes, walking and running through the wilderness. We were gathering plants, berries, vegetation, and hunting. Now, sweat is very interesting because not all animals sweat. So I'm sure some of you have heard of stories of like people chasing pigs until they die. They overheat because they don't sweat. So you can chase a pig, and you can keep chasing it and keep chasing it, keep chasing it, and eventually it will fall over dead because it can't cool itself off like we can. My dog doesn't sweat. She pants. So she pants to stay cool, but panting is not as efficient as sweating at cooling off. Because when you pant, you're just evaporating water on the tongue, in the mouth, and then in the lungs. But when you sweat like we do, you got sweat on the whole surface area of your body, from your head down to your toes and your fingertips. And that evaporation of water that has sodium in it cools you off. And that is really critical to the niche that humans have lived in for a long time. And that niche is being able to cool off and run. So there's a very interesting book called Born to Run by, I think is Christopher McDougall. I don't think he's related to Dr. John McDougall, who I learned, unfortunately, he passed away. At the last video, I talked about John McDougall, and I read in the comments that people said he passed away about a month ago. So it's with a heavy heart, because I'm very grateful for his work in trying to help people be healthy. He's a really great man, and I'm just very grateful that he chose to live the way he did. But this book, Born to Run, is by, I think, Christopher McDougall. Let me just double check that, because I want to make sure I give him the right credit. Yes, Christopher McDougall. And that book is about it's about running, but there's very interesting stories in it where he was talking about I think it was a paleoanthropologist, but an anatomist specialist who really examined why are our bodies shaped the way they are. Like, what function do the shape of our body have, and why do we walk on 2 feet? Because we have 4 limbs. Most animals walk on all 4 limbs. Even our ape cousins, they spend a lot of time on all 4s, like gorillas and chimpanzees. But we don't. And so this is very critical to our talk, but it's kind of a small digression, but we'll go there. So, what does salt have to do with running and with the niche that we live in? So, humans have kind of interestingly shaped body. We have, let's see, I'm trying to get my head in this view here, but there's a big notch back here. If you feel on the back of your head, you'll feel this bump. Anatomically, it's called the inion, but that's not really important. What's important is that there's a bump, and then if you feel here, there's this thick band of cartilage. You can't actually feel the bones right here. You can feel the bones down here, but like right here, between this bump on the head and the first bones you can't really feel the bones because there's a thick band of cartilage here. And what that anatomist figured out is that that only exists in animals that run. So if you look at animals that walk, they don't run, they just walk. They actually don't have this bump and thick band of cartilage. What it does is it helps stabilize our heads when moving very quickly, when running. So when you're running, you're moving your body, and then this allows your head to stay stable so you can see while your body is turning and rotating very quickly. All right, so we got that adaptation, and we walk on 2 feet. We're bipedal. And what that does is it changes the way that you breathe when you're running. So when you're running, when my dog Doobie runs, she's got all 4s, so she will pull the ground with her front paws, and then her back paws will grab the ground and then pull down, and then her front paws will reach out, grab the ground, and pull down. So because she uses all 4s, she can only breathe when her body stretches out, when her front paws reach out in front of her. Then her lungs expand, and then when she pulls her front paws down and does essentially like an abdominal crunch, and she breathes out. So she's limited to breathing 1 breath per gait stroke. So Okay, so that's how Doobie breathes when she runs. It's also how cheetahs breathe, and lions breathe when they run, and deer. But we're different. We run on 2 feet, and our arms are free. So when we're running, our arms, they're swinging to keep our balance because our legs are going back and forth. But we're not limited to taking 1 breath per stride. We can breathe out however much we want because our arms are free and our rib cage is free to breathe multiple times each stride. All right, so those are 2 adaptations that humans have that give us an advantage when hunting animals. The third thing is that none of those first 2 things would matter if you can't cool off. You have to be able to cool off in order to keep going. And so this is where sodium, salt, really is integral to this whole thing. Humans lost their hair on most of their body. So if you look at chimpanzees and gorillas, they have hair all over the place. Maybe not on their face, but on a lot of their body. We lost a lot of that hair. I mean, we still got hair in, under the armpit, pubic hair, and then some hair on the arms and legs and chest, but not that much. Instead, we've got exposed skin, and that skin sweats, and that's made possible by salt. Because I was saying earlier that the water doesn't really exist in its pure form without any salt in it. It goes where the salt is. So the way our salt glands work is they excrete the sodium, and then water follows the sodium out into the outside of our skin, and then that's where it evaporates, and then you can sometimes see dried up salt on your skin, face, or clothing. And that's to cool us off. So those are three things that humans do that really set them apart from other animals. They're able to run. They have the anatomy to run and keep their head stable so you can see while you're running. We run on 2 legs, and that allows us to breathe multiple times per stride. So we can breathe more, we can get more oxygen into our body than other animals. And we sweat a lot, so we can cool off, even with heavy exertion of the muscles, which generates heat, or in hot environments. So if you look in like Africa, in the savannah, in the middle of the day, it is just way too hot for animals to do anything. They just rest in the shade. They don't do much. But humans can still move around in that really hot weather because we can sweat and cool off. So, that gives us some advantages over the other animals. And I think this is what defines the niche that we lived in for a long time. Because we're not the fastest animal. A deer can easily outrun us. Same thing with bears and lions and cheetahs and a lot of other animals. But while they can outrun us in the short term, we can outrun them in the long term. So because we can cool off and we can breathe better, our endurance is longer. We can run for a very long time, and a deer might spurt ahead. So let's pretend that this is the deer. So this is the deer. This is human. Deer might be really fast, but then it has to rest because it overheats. Human is running, not as fast. Sees the deer. The deer says, "Oh no, the hunter is coming. I gotta run." So it runs away, but then it overheats and has to rest. But the human doesn't have to rest. It just keeps going, and then the deer will say, "Oh no, the hunter's getting closer." It spurts away, but the human can track the deer, can see it or follow its hoof prints, and eventually the deer overheats and it can't run anymore, and then the hunter has the deer. So our niche is that we are endurance runners. We can sweat, we can breathe well, and we can operate in very hot environments because we can cool off. When other animals, they can't really move around that well. So that's the niche. Sodium is integral to the niche that we lived in. And sodium is very hard to come by. So whenever our body came across sodium, it developed a way to store it very efficiently, so that the next time we see an animal and we want to go hunt it, it's available to us so we can sweat. So there's a way that the body really efficiently soaks up the sodium from whatever we eat, whether that's plants or the prey that we killed. It will take that sodium and it will very efficiently extract it and store it away in our body. And we're going to talk about storage. Like, how does the body store the salt? Because if you're running for a long time, you need to be able to re-access those stores and generate sweat. I guess I'll talk about that now. Let's see here. Yeah, okay. We'll talk about storage. So, just to recap. So what we talked about was the niche that we lived in for a very long time, why sodium is so integral to our ability as humans to have an advantage over the other animals around us. So how does our body store it? Because it's hard to come by. So how does our body store it inside our body so that we have it with us wherever we go? So we talked about how sodium is in the water, the fluid, but is always kept at a very particular concentration. So if you wanted to store more salt in your body, in the fluid, you'd have to carry more fluid around. But if anyone has picked up a gallon of water, or 4 liters of water is really heavy. So storing salt in the form of a saltwater solution is not an efficient way to store water. What you want to do is you want to store salt in its insoluble form. That means like a solid form, where it's super concentrated, like the table salt that you might have at home, like in a salt shaker. That's super concentrated. It's just salt. Sodium and chloride is table salt. What you want to do is you want to store the salt without the water, because water is so heavy. So the way our body does that is it stores salt in skin and muscle and other areas that have collagen. So collagen is a molecule. It's a type of molecule in our body that makes up cartilage and other connective tissues like skin. Also, bone has collagen. Muscles, blood vessels, they all have collagen. And the way that the body stores the salt is actually mainly in the skin and some in the muscle, but probably in those other organs I just mentioned, like bone, cartilage. It stores the sodium ions by attaching it to negative ions in a protein. Glycosaminoglycans, I believe that's what they're called. And it stores them in a solid form, away from the water. And that's inside the skin, muscles, bones, cartilage. Now, that information was not known when I was doing medical school. Some really smart doctors. There's a doctor named Jens Titze, Titze, who works in Singapore. He did a lot of this important work to try to figure out where does the body store sodium. And a lot of this was discovered in the late 2010s. So that was after I did medical school. So now we know the body stores the salt in an insoluble form without water, in a very lightweight form, in the skin and muscles and connective tissue. Now, that's important for the spine, and that really deserves its own talk. So that's how does degenerative disc disease occur? But we'll talk about that in a later episode. This one just going to focus on salt and what we can do to have a good salt balance. All right, so the body stores it in salt, and it generates fat, because fat, you can surround the fat with a salty brine. So skin, muscle, and generating fat. So there's different kinds of fat. There's fat that's just underneath the skin, called subcutaneous adipose tissue. If I had no fat on my face, I would look pretty ghastly. I would look like a skeleton. So I got fat here. I've got fat here, but I also got fat on inside my belly. That fat's not good fat. That's called visceral fat. There's also fat that can occur in between the muscle fibers. That's also not good fat. That's the visceral fat, and then the fat that's in between the muscle fibers. Those are fat stores that the body made to store excess salt that we eat. So I have some visceral fat, which I'm trying to work off using this information, but it is there. The body generates that fat to store excess salt. Okay, so it's not that the body is a douchebag body that is doesn't know what it's doing. No, it knows exactly what it's doing, and it's trying to help you and me survive. Because the body doesn't know that we live in modern agricultural civilization. It's the program that the body is following is the program that helped really well for 290,000 years of us running around and chasing prey that can't cool off as well as we can. So in that program, our body wants to store away salt whenever we come across it, so that we can have access to it to chase our prey and catch that woolly mammoth, and be able to eat the meat. Also run and walk to forage berries and vegetation, and move with the seasons, move with the herds. That's how our body is programmed, and that's why it is storing salt in these what we call bad fats, visceral fat in between the muscle fibers. in those times, you didn't come across salt that much. So, when you did, the body could temporarily store away the salt there, but you'd end up using it up, and those visceral fats and fats in between the muscle fibers would go away, and there would be no problem. But then today, we're not chasing deer until they overheat. We're sitting at a computer, or a lot of us are, or sitting at a desk, or sitting on the sofa, and we keep eating salt, and we keep making this bad fat, visceral fat, other fats, and we just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then all sorts of things happen. Our sugars don't function right. We get diabetes. We get inflammation, which means the body's not healing well. In fact, it might be even attacking normal tissue. And I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that right now. So, when we eat a very high salt diet, so more salt than we need, and we continuously do that, what happens is the body is storing away the salt and making more fat to store away more salt. And in the process, excuse me. In the process, it changes our immune system and the bacteria that live in our gut, called the microbiome. I'll talk about microbiome in the next episode, the farting episode. But the high salt changes the microbiome, and it changes our immune system into what's called a pro-inflammatory state. Now that sounds like a bad thing, it is a bad thing in the way that we live, where we don't move around and we don't sweat much. But it was actually a very good thing back when we did move around a lot and we sweated all day long, because what it would do is it would make more fat, store the sodium in the skin, and then we'd have it for the next time. But now, the high salt actually, it activates the immune cells that are used to repair things and fight off infections. It makes them aggravated, and then sends them into a pro-inflammatory state where they sometimes attack normal tissue and cause autoimmune problems, but also they don't heal things as well, because they're busy making sodium stores. So yeah, if we get too much salt and we're not using it, our body ends up breaking down. It doesn't heal that well. We get overweight. We have fat in the wrong places, that is meant to be used, but we don't end up using it. And so that's where the problem comes in. So we live now in an environment that is not like the niche that we lived in for the majority of our existence. So there's a balance of you need enough salt for what you're doing, for how much you're sweating. Okay, so this is really the crux of this whole episode, is you want to get the right balance of sodium for how much you're sweating. Now, to try to figure that out, because luckily now we got science and we can measure sodium amounts in all kinds of foods, and so this is actually very helpful for us to figure some things out. If we look at hunter-gatherer tribes that are alive today, they get around 5. Oh, got a visitor. Hello. Good morning. Doobie just woke up. All right, so if we look at our hunter-gatherer tribes that are still alive and and kind of living the way that most people used to. They're in isolation in like the Amazon or places like that. Anthropologists have gone and they've actually measured how much sodium and potassium hunter-gatherers typically eat. And that is around, for sodium, it's around 700 milligrams. Okay, 700 milligrams. Now, and then for potassium, it's 11,000 milligrams versus 700. So in hunter-gatherer tribes, their ratio of sodium to potassium is 1 to 16. Yes, 16. 1 to 16. But in our society, we flip that around backwards. The average person nowadays is eating, instead of 700 milligrams of sodium, we're eating like 3,000 something, like 3,500. I mean, Koreans, I'm Korean, or my parents grew up in Korea, but in Korea, a lot of Koreans eat 10,000 milligrams of sodium each day with salty foods. So 10,000 versus 700 milligrams. And also our potassium intake is lower. And so the average person nowadays gets 3,500 or so of sodium and like 2,300 or something like that of potassium. So really, the way our bodies function the best is how these hunter-gatherers are eating, which is just enough sodium to provide cooling and sweat and hydration, but not too much, and a ton of potassium to balance out the sodium, because they really are kind of like yin and yang. They kind of counteract each other. Sodium's on the outside of the cell, potassium's on the inside, and so it's a balance. Potassium and sodium. Okay. So nowadays we're eating way too much sodium and not enough potassium. So that's sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Let's see. Okay, so I think the next part here is to just really kind of get an idea, like, what is 700 milligrams of sodium? Like, how much is that based off of common foods? So let's go online. We'll go on an online adventure, and we'll figure out how much sodium is in just regular foods. So let's see here. Let's look up a slice of bread. Slice of bread, sodium. 147 milligrams in a typical white bread slice. Large, 30 grams. Okay, so one slice of bread, 147 milligrams. If you have a sandwich, you usually have 2 pieces of bread. So that's about 300 milligrams of sodium. So if you were trying to shoot for 700 milligrams of sodium, which is what these hunter-gatherer tribes are doing, and you have 2 slices of bread, you already are at almost halfway to your daily sodium limit. And that's not including what's in between the bread. If you put sandwich meat, let's see. Let's look up pastrami. I'm just coming up with some kind of meat. All right, 1 slice of pastrami. In between that bread, it's 300 milligrams. All right, so now we're already at 600 milligrams, and we haven't even put in cheese yet. So let's say a slice of mozzarella cheese. Mozzarella cheese. One slice. Oh, that's the low sodium. Let's see just the regular one. Oh, wow. Now that's 6 slices. All right, so one ounce of whole milk mozzarella cheese, 178 milligrams. All right, so now we're at 780 about. So we're already over the daily limit for sodium based off of hunter-gatherer tribes. They're eating around 700 milligrams of sodium in the whole day, and with our pastrami mozzarella sandwich, I didn't even put mayonnaise or mustard in it. Let's just look up mayonnaise. That's 88. That's just 1 tablespoon. And then let's look up mustard. 57 milligrams. All right, so I don't even know how much we're at now. 780. I mean, we're coming up on 900 or 1,000 milligrams in our one serving of a pastrami sandwich with mozzarella, mayonnaise, and mustard. And we're already over 700 milligrams for the whole day, and that's just one meal. That's just like lunch. Okay, so if you look at other foods, I mean, we'll look up a slice of pizza. I love pizza. Tastes so yummy. 1 slice of pizza, 14-inch regular crust, but you only have 1 slice. That's 640 milligrams. That's already very close to the maximum daily limit that these hunter-gatherer tribes are doing. That's 1 slice, and I don't think I've ever eaten just 1 slice of pizza because it's so yummy. You want to eat 2 or 3 or 4, or sometimes even the whole pizza if you're like really hungry. If you eat the whole pizza, let's see here. 1 pizza, wow, 5,000 milligrams. I was eating some potato chips last night. So let's look at how much sodium is in potato chips. Let's see, which one was I eating? I was eating kettle potato chips with honey Dijon flavoring. Honey Dijon kettle potato chips. Sodium for 1 serving, 250 milligrams. I probably had 2 servings, so I probably had 500 milligrams of sodium in just the potato chips, which were a snack after I ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that wasn't very good. That wasn't a good choice for me yesterday. But it was very yummy, and it's very hard not to eat yummy things. So that's why this talk is actually really important. I mean, for me, for other people. How do you help your body heal? How do you help it stay healthy? Because we've got all these easily accessible foods. Oh, one more thing is, let's look up how much is in a Chipotle burrito. Now, okay, we won't look up brands because I don't want to catch some flack from some corporation. All right. 1 burrito with beans. It says 2 pieces. So I guess two burritos. Burrito with beans, beef, and cheese. Okay. Yeah, it's about 1,000 milligrams for 2 pieces. I assume that they mean smaller burritos because sometimes restaurants give you a giant burrito that's like this big, and yeah, that's going to be over 1,000 milligrams of sodium. I remember looking up, there's a restaurant that I used to get burritos from down here until I saw how much sodium they put in there. It was like 1,300 milligrams. So like twice the limit of the hunter-gatherers, what they're eating. All right, so this shows how easy it is to eat too much sodium. And our body, which is programmed to say, oh, sodium is so hard to come by. Whenever we come by it, we're going to store it away in the skin and the fat and the muscles. When we have food like this, processed foods, which are high in salt, it's very easy to eat too much sodium. Now, in contrast, we're going to look at unprocessed foods. Let's look up broccoli. One serving of broccoli, 49 milligrams. So it has some sodium, not that much. Let's look up kale. Sodium in kale. 29 milligrams. Okay, now we're talking double digits rather than 4 digits. We're not talking about thousands of milligrams. We're talking about like 50 or 30. Let's look up sodium in chickpeas. 3 milligrams. Oh, that's in a tablespoon. Let's just say 1 cup. Oh, yeah, about 48. How about brown rice? Oh, only 10 milligrams. And then let's look at a potato, like a sweet potato. Oh, about 73 milligrams, so a little bit more. But, and then we'll look up some fruits. How much is in blueberries? I like blueberries. 1 cup of raw blueberries contains only 1 to 1.5 milligrams of sodium. Okay, so hardly any sodium, but tons of potassium. Look, 112 milligrams of potassium versus only 1 milligram of sodium in a cup of blueberries. All right, so this I think is the key to why what I talked about in the first episode, why patients who eat mostly plant-based and low sodium heal the best. Because I think that while these unprocessed whole foods, plant-based foods are very low in sodium. Some fruits have only like 1 milligram, and then the vegetables and like tubers, like sweet potatoes, they have 50, 70 milligrams in a serving. But these processed foods, like a slice of pizza, has 1 slice has 600, and if you eat the whole pizza, it's 5,000. Okay, so you definitely want to stay away from processed foods because they're going to give you way too much salt, way more than you actually need. And whole food, which means unprocessed, plant-based food has very little sodium and lots of potassium because you need more potassium than sodium. So I think that's why the patients who eat that way are actually healing very well and staying healthy. Now, the question is, can you eat meat and be healthy? Because the first talk, I was talking about how in the research studies and in watching my patients, the patients who ate mostly veggies and fruits and whole grains, they were healthier than the ones who ate a lot of meat. And there are a lot of doctors and patients who have done a carnivore diet and they got really healthy. A lot of health problems went away. And I think that you can do that. You don't have to do a plant-based diet. But you'd have to be extra careful, though. Let me show you a serving of chicken. Let's see, chicken, sodium. All right, so 1 cup of diced chicken, 115 milligrams of sodium. So that's like double what was in, well, not quite double, but yeah, double what was in like broccoli or potato. And way more than what's in, like 100 times more than what's in a blueberry, a serving of blueberries. So can you eat, well, let's look at another meat. We'll look up fish. Let's say salmon. Salmon's yummy. 117 milligrams in a half fillet, or 59 milligrams in 100 grams. That's actually not that bad. And then beef. Let's look up beef. 61 milligrams in a serving of beef. Okay, so this is without any salt added to it. Now, if you eat beef, and you don't put any salt on it, it really doesn't taste as good. You really want to usually add a lot of salt to it to make it taste good. Same thing with chicken. I mean, I think in the supermarket, a lot of the chicken has salt brine injected into the meat. I don't know if they still do that, but I know they used to do that. So these numbers here are if you don't add any salt to the meat. Okay, so can you stay below 700 milligrams a day eating a carnivore diet? The answer is yes, you can. But it's a little bit harder because there's more sodium in animal foods than there are in the plant foods. Maybe not that much, but probably by a factor of about 2 or 1.5. Okay, and in order to make it taste good, you usually have to salt it. So this is where it gets very tricky to do a carnivore diet and help your body stay healthy. It's possible, but you have to be very mindful about what you're doing. So do you have to be vegan or vegetarian or mostly whole food plant-based? Well, no, you don't. But if you are primarily animal food based, you have to be extra mindful about what you're doing in order to help your body be healthy. Okay, so I think that's very important to realize, and I've been kind of realizing that as I've been researching for this talk. Okay, so we talked about what are the common sodium levels in the different foods. All right, so what in this last part I'm going to talk about, it's really a balance of how much sodium you intake and how much you sweat. And we'll talk about what's a good number, a sodium number to shoot for, and how does that number change based off of environmental factors and exercise factors. Okay, so American Heart Association says ideally we should be getting 1,500 milligrams of sodium maximum in the day. Okay, so that gives us some leeway. So you need at least 500 milligrams in the day just to function. Okay, so we looked at hunter-gatherer tribes. They're getting around 700 milligrams. So they're really just right above the basic minimum you need to survive each day, which is 500. So these hunter-gatherer tribes are getting 700. They're giving their bodies a little leeway, about 200 milligrams each day. But American Heart Association is recommending ideally we should get a maximum of 1,500 milligrams. They say for sure don't go above 2,300 milligrams, which almost all Americans do. And probably most people in developed countries are over that 2,300 milligram sodium limit. But ideally they say be at 1,500 milligrams or less. So in my mind, that healthy range is probably 700 milligrams to 1,500 milligrams of sodium. But it is a balance, because if you're sweating a lot, if you're living like our hunter-gatherer ancestors and you're sweating all day long, let's say Well, you don't even have to be living, you don't have to be chasing deer. You could be working a construction job, you know, uh, building a highway in the middle of the summer in the heat, in the sun. You're moving heavy stuff. You're standing outside. And you're sweating non-stop all day long. Well, you're losing sodium pretty rapidly just to cool off and not overheat. In that situation, you actually need to replenish that salt. So you need to eat saltier. You need more than 700 milligrams of sodium. If you live in Mexico and you don't have air conditioning and it's really hot and you're sweating all day long, you need to eat salty. And I think that's why a lot of cuisines in hotter areas are actually very salty. So if you think about Mexican food, you've got salsas, guacamole, you got corn tortilla chips that are salted. You've got burritos we already looked at could be upwards of 1,000 milligrams of salt. If you live in a very hot environment, you need to actually eat salty if you're sweating a lot. Now, you could live in Mexico or India where it's really hot and be in air-conditioned rooms all day long, and you don't actually sweat. In that case, you really need to be sticking with the 700 to 1,500 milligram sodium limit in order for your body to function properly. Okay, so it's really a balance of salt intake and salt excretion through sweat. Now, an advantage that we have, we can kind of hack this biological programming in that if we want to eat salty still, like if we just really like the taste of salting the food or having food that has salt in it, you can excrete the salt. You can hack your body's biological programming by inducing sweating. So that can be exercise, but it could also be just sitting in a hot tub or a sauna. So many cultures in cold climates, I'm thinking like Scandinavians, like Finnish people, Swedish people, they have saunas. So they have developed ways to make the body sweat artificially, essentially, by heating their local environment, like in a bathhouse or a dry sauna. They are creating a very hot environment so their body sweats and excretes the salt. And there's health benefits for that. In fact, the health benefits of going to a thermal spring, so that's like a hot water spring heated with geothermal activity, volcanic activity. The health benefits of sitting in those warm springs and sweating was written about even in like 400 BC in Greece. Greek, I guess they were physicians, doctors. They were writing that if you go to a thermal spring, and you sit there in the waters, it cures problems of the skin, bones, and joints. Okay, so somehow they knew in 400 BC that sweating in a hot environment repairs skin problems and joint problems. Now, how do they know that? I have no idea, because they didn't have the science that we have. And it's really just in the last 10 years that we figured out that salt is stored in the skin and bones and joints and collagen. I didn't know that. We didn't know that when I was in medical school in 2004. So these ancient Greek docs, they actually knew if you go and you sit in a hot tub, essentially it's a hot tub, this geothermal spring, you're going to actually fix skin problems and joint problems because you're excreting excess salt. Okay, so humans are really smart. I mean, they're able to figure things out. And this is an important point. You don't actually have to know the exact mechanism of how everything works. You can just figure out the hack. The hack is if you sweat more, you can be healthier. It can balance out increased salt intake or excess salt intake that's not needed. All right, so you don't need to actually know the science to benefit from it. You can just use the hack. So it's a balance. Sodium intake versus salt excretion. If you live in a cold environment, I live in the Pacific Northwest. It is cool about majority of the year. Summer, some months in the summer it can be very warm, but majority of the year is kind of cool and cloudy and rainy. And I'm not sweating. Even if I go for a run outside, if it's cold outside and it's rainy, I'm not sweating very much. So up here, I need to eat less salt, less sodium, and more potassium. Now that being said, I went for a very long mountain hike. It was 22 miles this like 3 or 4 days ago with my buddy Whiskey Rye. And we hiked all the way up into the mountains and then back down through this valley. It was a through hike. 22 miles. And I brought granola bars that had sodium in it. I brought like 6 of them because they're highly dense, easy to package, and they're light. Lots of calories, but each one had about 150 milligrams, and I brought about 6 of them. So that's 6 times 150. I can do math somewhat. 300, 600, 900 milligrams. Okay, so I brought 900 milligrams of sodium with me, and I hiked 22 miles, and I was sweating because it was warm, and I was climbing up a mountain. I was really exerting myself and sweating pretty much all day. It took 14 hours to do. And I actually started running out of salt in my body. And I think I developed short-term hyponatremia, which means not enough sodium in my body. And so this is really important because most people suffer from having too much sodium in the body, and that causes all sorts of ailments, obesity, diabetes problems because of the metabolic dysfunction, inflammation where your body doesn't heal. But there's also the danger of having too little. So let's look up what happens if you have too little sodium. So hyponatremia symptoms, and I'll tell you what I experienced too. What I experienced in when I ran out of enough sodium was that I was getting a headache. I got a headache. It was just kind of generalized headache up here, and I felt lethargic, and my thinking was slowing down. I usually Whiskey Rye and I converse during our hikes the whole time, just talking about whatever. But both of us, towards the end there, we couldn't really talk very well because we were so tired, one, but I think it was actually I didn't have enough salt. I should have brought a salt packet with me, but I didn't during that time because I thought I had brought enough. All right, so symptoms of hyponatremia. Let's see if we can enlarge this because this is super important because you do not want to die from not having enough salt. Nausea and vomiting. Well, that would be really bad. Headache. I think headache is probably one of the first ones. That's interesting because one of the reasons why we think sodium is named sodium is because in Arabic, headache is named Suda, S-U-D-A, which means headache. And salt was used to treat headaches, because back then, I guess, maybe it was harder to come by salt still. And so if you get a headache, if you have some salt, headache would go away. Confusion, loss of energy, drowsiness and fatigue, restlessness and irritability, muscle weakness, spasms or cramps, and if it's really bad, seizures, coma, and then death should be down here, but they don't list that. Okay, so if you're having these feelings, nausea, vomiting, mainly headache, confusion, loss of energy, restlessness, irritability, these types of things, and you've been sweating a lot, and then you really want to think about, do you have enough salt? And you may want to have something that's salty. All right, so we talked about kind of upper limits and lower limits of this salt balance. I think that covers pretty much all the things that I wanted to talk about. Yeah. So, so to recap, our bodies developed in a very special niche where we were endurance runners in a hot environment, and we had an advantage over other animals because we could cool off and we could run and we could breathe and deliver more oxygen to our body. And we are not the fastest animals on land, but we have the best endurance, and so we could hunt these animals. Okay, and sodium is really hard to come by, and you need sodium to sweat, to cool off. So our bodies got really good at absorbing the sodium from our food and storing it away in our skin and muscles and the collagen in the bones and joints. And so in today's environment, where we don't live like that anymore, where most of us don't, we eat too much sodium. And that causes our body to constantly store up the sodium in unhealthy ways, in unhealthy fats like visceral fat, fat in between the muscles. And I've seen this actually when I used to do spine surgery. I would see the patients that had really bad joints. I would cut through the skin, and first of all, the skin was thicker. So, a younger, well, not even younger, just a healthier patient that might have had a disc problem. If I cut through their skin, their skin would be maybe that thick, and it'd be soft and stretchy, easily would slice through, and then there'd be just some fat underneath. And then you reach the muscle, and the muscle would be completely just red muscle fibers. But in an unhealthy patient who had really bad degenerative disc disease in the spine, what I would physically see just with my own eyes is that their skin would be, instead of this thick, it'd be like that thick. Like it'd be really thick, and it'd be really tough, like a hard leather that it'd be hard to cut through. Almost like crunchy, but not really crunchy, but it lost its pliability, its stretchiness. And then underneath that thickened skin was fat that was very interesting. It wasn't just like globules of yellow fat. It was like white fat with this kind of watery, briny solution in that area between the skin and the muscle. Sometimes it was so much water that I'd be like, what the heck? Where's all this water coming from? Now, I didn't have a way to test its sodium content, but I suspect that water probably had a lot of salt in it. And then when I would get down to the muscle layer right above the bones, I would see actually a lot of fat intermixed in between the red muscle fibers. So there's red muscle fibers, and then there'll be yellow or white fat that's in between the muscle fibers, and it shouldn't be there. That is the body's storage of excess sodium, both in the skin, in the subcutaneous fat, and in the fat that's intermixed in between the muscle fibers, which it shouldn't be there. All right, I would see that with my own eyes and feel it while I'm doing spine surgery. And those were in the patients that had the worst joint disease. And so, I will talk, I'll have an episode dedicated to spine problems. But the salt issue is integral. And the other thing is there is a condition called ankylosing spondylitis, or DISH, DISH, which is an acronym. But what that means is that the body has all sorts of joints on the spine. There's many different bones. There's like 7 neck bones, 12 thoracic bones from here to here, and then 5 lumbar bones in your low back. And they all have 3 joints in between each bone. Well, most of them, except for at the very top. And there's a condition where the body gets inflamed, and then it starts locking down each joint one by one. One by one, they start locking down, and then eventually some patients end up with their whole spine doesn't move anymore, it's fused. Instead of being able to bend like this and twist like that, they're stuck. They can't move. And then they're very prone to getting a bad fracture, because if you fall down, even just falling from your chair, if your spine can't absorb the shock, like bending, then it can just snap like that. And I would see that occasionally. But the interesting thing is, I only saw that very infrequently in where I trained in neurosurgery, which was in a very hot climate. It's in the U.S., but it's in an area of the U.S. that is very, very hot and humid, so you're sweating a lot. I didn't see that problem where the spine locked up very often there. It would be very rare. But then I moved. I've had a couple jobs in my career. One of them is up here in the Pacific Northwest. And another one was in a state that's very cold. Very, 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 very cold in the United States. And what I saw was that there was way more prevalence of this locking up of the spine. And I said, well, why is it that I'm seeing that way more in these cold climates? And I think it's because in these cold climates, most people were eating the same way that the people in the warm climates are eating. They're getting way too much salt and they're not sweating enough. And that just causes inflammation in the body, and the body keeps storing extra salt that it doesn't need, and that causes these joints to get inflamed, injured, and the body's way of healing that is locking them down, fusing them. All right, so I've seen this in patients, and that once they lock down, you can't unlock it. It's permanent. Okay, so so there are some permanent damages that can happen from getting too much salt and not sweating enough. We don't live in that niche anymore of outrunning deer or other animal prey. So in today's environment, where most people don't have to move around very much, we just have to be mindful that don't eat too much sodium, and have a good balance between how much sodium you're eating and how much you're sweating. That is how you help your body heal. Well, I hope that you find this information helpful, and I'm looking forward to see what people say in the comments. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day.